Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I've been living in this small apartment building for about 3 years now. It's not fancy, but it's home. 11 stories high, nothing special. I'm on the second floor, which is usually great. Easy to take the stairs if needed. But lately, it's been a real pain. You see, there's this family on the 11th floor. They've been driving everyone nuts for months. Their biggest offense? Hogging the elevator like it's their personal toy. They'll call it up, then hold the doors open for ages while they wait for someone in their apartment to join them. It's infuriating, especially when you're in a hurry. At first, I tried to be understanding. Maybe they had a good reason, right? But after weeks of this, my patience wore thin. I started taking the stairs more often, just to avoid the hassle. But that's not always practical, especially when you're carrying groceries or coming home tired from work. I tried talking to them once, politely explained how inconvenient it was for everyone else. Their response was infuriating. The woman, who I've started calling Karen in my head, dismissed my concerns. She claimed it wasn't a big deal and implied that since they pay rent too, they can use the elevator however they want. That's when I knew reasoning with them was pointless. They just didn't care about anyone else in the building. Yesterday was the last straw. I had a long day at work, was looking forward to getting home and relaxing. I called the elevator from the lobby and surprise, it was stuck on the 11th floor. Again, I waited for a few minutes, hoping they'd finally get on with it. But nope. I could hear them chatting and laughing through the elevator shaft, completely oblivious to the inconvenience they were causing. That's when I decided enough is enough. I started walking up the stairs, my frustration growing with each step. As I passed each floor, a little idea popped into my head. A petty revenge, sure, but oh so satisfying. I stopped at every single floor on my way up. At each one, I pressed the button to call the elevator. By the time I reached my floor, I was grinning. I knew that when they finally decided to use the elevator, it would stop at every single floor on the way down. This morning, I woke up to the sound of angry voices in the hallway. I peeked out to see what was going on. Karen was complaining loudly about the elevator stopping at every floor, making them late for school. A neighbor suggested that maybe if they didn't hold the elevator open for so long, this would happen. Karen got defensive, asking if the neighbor was accusing them of something. The neighbor simply pointed out that many people had been complaining about how they used the elevator. Karen, still not getting it, declared they had every right to use the elevator and threatened to complain to the building manager. They had no idea it was me, but the sweet taste of revenge was satisfying nonetheless. Later that day, I ran into our building manager in the lobby. He looked stressed. I asked if everything was okay, and he explained he was dealing with complaints about the elevator. He mentioned that the family on the 11th floor was causing quite a stir. When I asked what happened, he told me about the elevator stopping at every floor that morning when they were trying to leave. Apparently, they were blaming everyone else in the building for pressing all the buttons. I feigned surprise and mentioned that many of us had been having issues with them holding the elevator open for long periods. The building manager acknowledged he'd heard those complaints too and decided it was time for a building-wide meeting to discuss elevator etiquette. I nodded, trying to hide my smile. Maybe some good would come out of this after all. The next week, we had that meeting. Everyone showed up, including the family from the 11th floor. The building manager laid out some new rules. He announced that holding the elevator open for more than 30 seconds would now be prohibited. If someone needed more time, they should let the elevator go and call it again when ready. He also warned that pressing all the buttons as a prank would result in a warning, with repeated offenses potentially leading to fines. The family from the 11th floor looked annoyed, but they couldn't argue without admitting to their behavior. As for me, I was more than happy to comply with the new rules. My wife and I had just moved into our dream home a few months ago. It was a cozy little place with a big backyard, perfect for hosting barbecues and maybe even starting a family someday. We were excited to meet our new neighbors and become part of the community. That's when we met her. The woman next door seemed nice enough at first. She brought over a welcome basket and introduced herself as our new neighbor. But it didn't take long for us to realize there was something off about her. It started with small things. She'd borrow our lawnmower without asking and return it with no gas. Or she'd let her dog use our yard as a bathroom and never clean it up. We tried to be patient and understanding, figuring she was just a bit scatterbrained. But then things took a turn for the worse. Her husband got sick, terminal cancer. It was awful, and we felt terrible for them. We offered to help however we could, bringing over meals and offering to run errands. That's when she showed up at our door with the craziest request I've ever heard. Karen asked if she could dig a grave for her dying husband in our backyard. She explained that she wanted to be close to him even after he was gone, and couldn't do it in her own yard because it would ruin her garden. She begged us, saying we had plenty of extra space. I was stunned. Was she serious? I tried to let her down gently. I apologized for their situation but explained that we couldn't allow that. I told her it wasn't legal and that it was a very strange request. I offered to help them find a nice cemetery nearby instead. Karen reacted poorly to my refusal. She accused us of being selfish and stormed off before I could respond further. My wife and I were baffled. We decided to let it go, hoping she'd come to her senses. A few nights later, I woke up to a noise in the backyard. I looked out the window and couldn't believe my eyes. There was Karen, illuminated by moonlight, digging a massive hole in our lawn. I rushed outside, my wife close behind me. I confronted Karen, asking what she thought she was doing and telling her she couldn't just break into our yard and start digging. Karen yelled back that this was for her husband. She called us heartless monsters and said she had to take matters into her own hands since we wouldn't let her do it properly. I warned her to stop immediately or I'd call the police. I acknowledged that she was going through a lot, but told her this behavior was insane. She ignored me completely, continuing to dig with manic energy. I stepped closer, wanting to make sure she heard me clearly. I pleaded with her to leave now and not make the situation worse than it already was. That's when it happened. As I approached, she suddenly whirled around, swinging the shovel with all her might. I felt a searing pain as it connected with my head. Everything went fuzzy, and I collapsed. The last thing I remember before passing out was my wife screaming and fumbling for her phone to call emergency services. I woke up in the hospital with a nasty concussion and several stitches. The police were there, wanting my statement. Apparently, they'd arrested Karen at the scene. She was facing charges for breaking and entering, vandalism, and assault with a deadly weapon. As I recovered, we learned more about the situation. Karen's husband had been moved to a hospice facility, cared for by their adult children. He passed away a few days later, never knowing about his wife's insane plan or her arrest. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People came forward with their own tales of Karen's entitled behavior over the years. It seemed she'd always been difficult, but the stress of her husband's illness had pushed her over the edge. Karen was sentenced to 5 years in prison for her crimes. Her family was mortified and apologized profusely to us. They even offered to pay for the damage to our yard and my medical bills. We decided to stay in our home, and we installed a top-notch security system and planted a beautiful garden where Karen had tried to dig her illegal grave. I'm a 28-year-old software developer, and a few months ago my cousin reached out to me. We weren't particularly close, but we'd always been on good terms. She was going through a rough patch. Her husband had left her, and she was struggling to make ends meet. She asked if she could crash at my place for a few weeks while she got back on her feet. Being the kind-hearted person I am, or so I thought, I agreed. The first few days were fine. My cousin seemed grateful, and we even had a few nice conversations over dinner. But then things started to change. It started small. She'd leave her dirty dishes in the sink, expecting me to clean up after her. Then she began inviting friends over without asking me first. I tried to be understanding, but it was starting to get on my nerves. One day, about 2 weeks into her stay, I came home from a rare day at the office to find her sprawled on my couch watching TV. I greeted her and asked about her day. She casually mentioned that she had used my computer to send some emails, hoping I wouldn't mind. I was taken aback. I hadn't given her permission to use my work computer, which had sensitive information on it. I explained to her that I did mind because it was my work computer with confidential data and asked her not to use it without permission in the future. She rolled her eyes and dismissed my concerns, telling me not to be so uptight since she hadn't broken anything. I decided to let it slide, not wanting to start an argument, but things only got worse from there. A few days later, I came home to find a stranger in my living room. I asked who he was, feeling confused and a bit alarmed. The stranger introduced himself as my cousin's friend, saying she had told him it was okay to crash at my place for a few days. I called out to my cousin, asking to talk to her. She sauntered out of the guest room, looking completely unconcerned. When I questioned her about the stranger in my living room, she nonchalantly explained that it was just her friend who needed a place to stay, so she told him he could crash here. I told her she couldn't just invite people to stay at my apartment without asking me first. She scoffed and asked why not, pointing out that I had let her stay here and questioned what the big deal was. I explained that it was my home and I get to decide who stays here. She rolled her eyes and dismissed my concerns, calling me selfish for making a fuss over her friend staying for just a few days. I was floored by her attitude, but I didn't want to cause a scene in front of her friend. I retreated to my room, fuming. The next day, I decided it was time to have a serious talk with my cousin. I found her in the kitchen, rummaging through my fridge. I told her we needed to talk about her stay here. With her mouth full of my food, she asked what about it. I explained that I thought it was time for her to start looking for her own place, reminding her that this was supposed to be a temporary arrangement and it had been almost 3 weeks. She laughed and said she wasn't going anywhere because she liked it here. I told her it wasn't up for discussion, that I'd been more than generous, but she was taking advantage of my hospitality. She suddenly became angry, accusing me of trying to kick her out and questioning where she was supposed to go. I clarified that I wasn't kicking her out right that second, but that she needed to start making plans to move out. She called me a jerk, asking how I could treat her this way after everything she'd been through. Then she stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door to the guest room behind her. The next day, I came home from work to find my apartment in chaos. There were empty beer cans strewn about, music blaring, and at least half a dozen people I didn't know lounging around my living room. I shouted over the music, demanding to know what was going on. My cousin stumbled over, clearly drunk. She greeted me enthusiastically, welcoming me to the party. I told her I hadn't agreed to any party. She slurred her words, telling me to lighten up and stop being so uptight, offering me a drink. I refused the drink and demanded everyone leave my apartment immediately. One of the strangers chimed in, calling me a buzzkill. I reiterated that this was my home, I hadn't agreed to this, and everyone needed to leave now, or I'd call the police. My cousin yelled that I wouldn't dare call the police because we were family. I told her to watch me and pulled out my phone, starting to dial. Suddenly, my cousin lunged at me, trying to grab my phone. In the scuffle, she knocked over a vase, shattering it on the floor. I shouted for everyone to get out immediately. To my surprise, most of the partygoers quickly gathered their things and left. My cousin, however, wasn't budging. She pleaded with me, saying I couldn't do this to her because she had nowhere to go. I told her that wasn't my problem anymore, that she had completely disrespected me and my home, and I wanted her out by tomorrow morning. She screamed that I couldn't evict her, claiming she had rights. I explained that she wasn't a tenant, just a guest who had overstayed their welcome, and told her to leave or I'd have her removed. She glared at me with tears in her eyes, finally agreeing to leave but warning me not to expect her to ever speak to me again. I replied that at this point that sounded like a blessing. She spent the next hour dramatically packing her things, all while cursing me under her breath. Finally, she stomped out of my apartment, slamming the door behind her. The next day, I received a barrage of angry messages from various family members. Apparently, my cousin had spun quite a tale about how I had cruelly thrown her out on the streets. I spent the next few days explaining the real story to anyone who would listen. Thankfully, most of my family knew my cousin's tendency to exaggerate and believed my side of the story. A week later, I received a surprising message from my aunt, my cousin's mother. She apologized for what her daughter had put me through, acknowledging that she had always been difficult. She informed me that my cousin was back home with them now, and they were trying to help her get her life together. She thanked me for trying to help her daughter, even if it didn't work out. Sometimes the best family members are the ones you don't have to see very often. Everything was great until we got a new manager. Let's call her Karen. From day one, Karen made it clear she didn't like me. Maybe it was my lack of a fancy degree, or maybe she just didn't like my face. Whatever the reason, she made my life hell. She'd nitpick everything I did, take credit for my ideas, and even tried to get me moved back to IT support. I was miserable, but with bills to pay and a sick mom to care for, quitting wasn't an option. That's when I discovered our office building's quirk, the elevators. The doors were timed to stay open longer than usual for moving sensitive equipment. Karen's office was on the 3rd floor, right outside the elevator, while I worked on the 2nd. And thus, my petty revenge plan was born. It started small. After a particularly cheesy pizza night, I let out a silent but deadly fart in the elevator and sent it up to the 3rd floor. From then on, whenever Karen was especially nasty, I'd wait for the right moment. Chilly night? Perfect. Loaded nachos? Even better. I'd step into that elevator, let one rip, and send my little gift up to the 3rd floor. Karen had no idea it was me. She thought there was something wrong with the elevator itself. I overheard her complaining in meetings, insisting that the elevator drain was causing the smell. Maintenance assured her multiple times that there was nothing wrong, but Karen wasn't having it. As time went on, Karen became obsessed with the elevator smell. She'd send angry emails to maintenance, complain in every meeting, and even tried to get the company to replace the entire elevator system. Watching her lose her mind over something so ridiculous was hilarious. But karma has a way of catching up. About 6 months into my elevator warfare, we had a big client visiting and Karen was giving them a tour. As they entered the elevator, I saw my chance. I quickly slipped in behind them, letting out the worst fart I'd been saving for days. The smell was so bad I almost gagged myself. As I got off on the 2nd floor, chaos erupted behind me. The clients were exclaiming in disgust. Karen was stammering, trying to explain that the elevator doesn't usually smell like that. I couldn't hear the rest as the doors closed, but I saw Karen's panicked face as she tried to salvage the situation. The next day, Karen was gone. The clients had complained to the CEO, and combined with all her previous complaints about the elevator, the company decided she was too high maintenance to keep around. So, yeah, that's my story of how I farted my way to a better work environment. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.